Hi, my name's Wim, and this will be my attempt at an argument for the existence of actual infinites, if God exists. My thesis is that a recursively structured poem, whose semantic and aesthetic identity depends in essence on infinite nesting, would necessarily be an actual infinite in God's mind. Before I outline my argument, it's helpful to mention William Lane Craig's views. Craig distinguishes between two kinds of infinites.
Let me address that question about the infinity of the future. Here, I think it is important to differentiate between two concepts of the infinite, the actual infinite and the potential infinite. According to Aristotle, actual infinites never exist. Infinity exists only in potentiality. For example, if you take any finite distance, you can divide it in half, and then in half again, and then in half again. And that can go on to infinity. And what Aristotle would say is that that finite distance is potentially infinitely divisible. It is infinite in the sense that infinity is a limit which you can endlessly approach, but at which you will never arrive. And that's in contrast to the idea of an actual infinite, where you have an actually infinite number of definite and discrete finite individuals that make up this collection.
So, a potential infinite is a sequence that grows without limit but is never complete, like counting 1, 2, 3, and so on forever. It's always finite at every stage, but potentially infinite in extent. Craig says the afterlife is such a potential infinite, always approaching infinity, but never actually reaching it. And an actual infinite, by contrast, is a completed totality of infinite elements, like an infinite library that already exists fully stocked with infinitely many books, or a hotel with infinite rooms. Craig argues that actual infinites cannot exist in the real world because they produce contradictions and absurdities. For example, in Hilbert's hotel, adding or removing infinite guests from an already infinite hotel leads to paradoxes. Important for my argument is that Craig doesn't apply this limitation to God's eternity. He believes God's knowledge is complete, eternal, and non-temporal, so claims that God does not require actual infinites to know everything.
Right, very good question. Don't Christians or theists think that God is infinite? And if an actual infinite cannot exist, then how can God exist? It's important to understand that infinity, when it's applied to God, isn't a mathematical concept. It's not a quantitative concept. When I'm speaking of an actual infinite, I'm talking about a set that has an infinite number of definite and discrete finite particulars, like the set of natural numbers, or the set of guests in a hotel, or a set of marbles or baseball cards. But when people talk about the infinity of God, this isn't a quantitative concept. God isn't a set composed of an infinite number of definite and discrete finite parts. Rather, it's a qualitative notion when one speaks of God's infinity. It just means things like God is all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good, eternal, necessary, all-present, and all of those superlative attributes.
So, divine omniscience, Craig argues, operates via a single timeless act, not through sequential or structured cognition. It's on that point I would like to press Craig's views with the following argument. And just from the outset, I'm not a philosopher, so take this with a grain of salt. 1. God is omniscient and omnipotent. Therefore, God fully apprehends every logically coherent object of thought, including intricate structures of meaning, form, and self-reference. 2. An infinitely recursive poem is a coherent concept. Imagine a poet arriving in heaven and resolving to write an infinitely recursive poem to capture the reality of infinity. She starts off with the first line, writing a poem about, and then at regular intervals adds that same line, writing a poem about, etc., etc. for all eternity. It is logically coherent to define a recursively structured poem, one whose form consists of infinite self-referential nesting, writing a poem about writing a poem about writing a poem about writing a poem about, where each level contributes essentially to the poem's identity. 3. The poetic structure is irreducible. The semantic and aesthetic identity of such a recursively structured poem cannot be reduced to a finite summary, compressed composition, or single act. Its meaning and aesthetic character supervene, that is, they depend entirely on its infinite layered recursive form, not just its abstract theme. The poem is the infinite nesting. It is not representable by a finite description without losing its aesthetic nature and identity. 4. To apprehend such a poem as it is, one must mentally instantiate or represent the entire recursive structure, not merely a finite outline or endpoint. A grasp of the whole necessarily includes the full infinitude of its nested layers, otherwise it is not the poem. 5. Given God's perfect omniscience, he fully apprehends the poem as it is, in its full recursive structure. Therefore, the actual infinite nesting must be instantiated in the divine intellect, not merely potentially or via shorthand. 6. The poem's infinite recursive structure thus exists as an actual infinite structure within God's mind, not merely as a finite rule or a potentially realizable sequence. On the basis of this argument, I conclude that Craig's claim that actual infinites cannot exist is undermined. If God exists and God can instantiate recursively structured poems whose identity and meaning depend on infinite nesting, then at least one actual infinite does exist in the divine mind. I think this is potentially strong and novel because it doesn't appeal to abstract mathematical thought experiments like Hilbert's hotel, but instead to structured cognition, how meaning and form are interwoven. It undercuts Craig's usual move of collapsing all divine knowledge into a single act by focusing on structure dependence. The poem's form is not dispensable. The pattern is not a wrapper. It is the meaning and the aesthetic quality, in essence. Craig might say, God doesn't need to instantiate each layer. He knows the totality in one timeless act.
Yes, I don't see any problem in thinking of a timeless being who has all his knowledge at once, so to speak, rather than sequentially.
But the poem's infinite syntactic recursion is essential to its identity, both in terms of the poem's meaning and aesthetic quality. To collapse the poem into a compressed rule like repeat infinitely writing a poem about is to replace it with a structurally different object. That is, it becomes a different poem with its own aesthetic and its own meaning. The recursive structure is not a byproduct, it constitutes the poem. If God knows the poem, he must instantiate the structure that makes it what it is. This argument presses a point which I think is often overlooked in Craig-style debates. You cannot eliminate an actual infinite structure by appealing to timelessness or omniscience, when the structure itself is essential to the thing being known. In this case, the poem's infinite form is its identity. Its meaning emerges only through its recursive architecture. If that structure exists in the divine mind, then an actual infinite exists. Tell me what you think, and see you next time. Bye.